Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we're diving into a brand new story. What if Belle has the power of infinity and Four Eyes Part 2? Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Depths and set up a gauntlet of impossible odds. The goal was simple. Survive. Do not rely on me to save you, Belle said, standing atop a rock as monsters began pouring in from every direction. You must learn to survive on your own. The members of Freya Familia clashed. With the floor bosses, giant beasts capable of wiping out lesser adventurers with a single blow. Belle remained on the sidelines, observing their tactics, letting them make mistakes and learn from them. By the time the final monster fell, the group stood victorious, battered but stronger. Each had pushed their limits and learned that sheer strength wasn't enough to win the war game. It was unity, strategy, and adaptation that would carry them to victory. The final night a meal before war as the month came to an end, Freya and Loki Familia gathered for a final meal at their respective homes. The air was tense, but filled with camaraderie. They had trained together, bled together, and now they would fight together in the days to come. Belle sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding. His powers had grown to a point where he surpassed even his wildest expectations. His limitless was flawless, his swordsmanship unmatched, and his magical energy control now capable of things even he hadn't imagined. Freya entered the hall, her eyes gleaming. As they found Belle, she walked over to him, her touch soft as she placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done more than I ever thought possible, she whispered. Belle looked at her, a soft smile on his face. I'm ready, Freya. Ready for whatever comes next. The next day would see the strongest familiars in Orario tearing each other apart. But tonight, they were a family united by a common goal. They shared stories, laughed, and ate heartily, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges that could tear them apart. The war game begins as dawn broke over Orario. The world braced itself for the greatest battle the city had ever seen. Freya Familia, led by Belle and Loki Familia, led by their strongest adventurers, were about to collide. In the heart of Orario, gods and mortals alike waited with bated breath for the storm to begin. The day of the war game had finally arrived. The air in Orario was thick with anticipation as the strongest adventurers from the Freya Familia and Loki Familia sat in their respective booths, awaiting the announcement of the war game rules. Tension filled the stadium-like arena that had been set up for this monumental clash, where the greatest of Orario's warriors would fight, not just for pride, but for their familia's future. Belle sat at the center of the Freya Familia's booth, surrounded by Otter, Alan, Hayden, and the other members who had fought alongside him in the dungeon during the grueling month of training. Across from them, Loki Familia sat, with Finn Daimner, Eyest Wallenstein, Reveria Ijos Alf, Gareth Landrock, Beat Loga, and the Amazon twins Tiona and Tyon, all with grim expressions. Freya leaned back in her seat, exuding confidence. Her eyes never left Belle, whose aura of power had grown so immense that even the gods felt it. Loki, seated across from her, wore a smug but tense expression, her eyes flicking between her Familia and the booth across from her. The announcer, a god with a booming voice, stepped forward into the center of the arena, amplified by magic for all the spectators to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, mortals and gods alike, today marks a historic moment in Orario. A battle between two of the strongest familiars this city has ever known, Freya Familia and Loki Familia. The crowd roared, shaking the very foundations of the arena. The rules of this war game are simple, one-on-one battles. However, the fighters do not need to switch out unless they are defeated. The winner will be the last familiar standing. The announcer's words hung in the air like a challenge to all watching. Everyone knew what was at stake. If Freya won, she would claim Finn, Reveria, and Eyest along with Beat and the Amazonesses as her own. If Loki won, she would gain all of Freya Familia's members who were level 7 or above. The weight of this clash wasn't just about power. It was about pride, influence, and dominance over Orario. The first match was announced. First up, the warlord of Freya Familia, Otter, versus the braver of Loki Familia, Finn Daimler. Fight 1, Otter vs. Finn Daimler. Otter stood from his seat, his massive frame looming over the other members of Freya Familia as he descended into the arena. Finn, ever composed and confident, followed suit, his spear gleaming under the sunlight as he stepped into the ring to face Otter. The crowd hushed as the two warriors faced each other. Finn, known for his strategy and precision, sized up Otter, knowing that brute strength alone wouldn't be enough to win this fight. With a signal from the announcer, the fight began. Finn dashed forward with blinding speed, his spear aimed at Otter's weak points, hoping to strike fast and hard. Otter, however, remained calm, blocking and parrying each strike with his great sword, his movements far too swift for his size. As Finn pressed the attack, Otter countered with devastating force. Their weapons clashed, creating shockwaves that rippled through the arena. Finn's agility kept him in the fight, but Otter's strength began to wear him down. The Boaz warrior was a fortress, and no matter how Finn tried to break through his defenses, Otter remained impenetrable. With a powerful overhead swing, Otter knocked Finn's spear aside and struck him with a crushing blow to the chest, sending him flying across the arena. Finn struggled to rise but fell to his knees, unable to continue the fight. "Otter is victorious," the announcer cried, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Freya's booth remained composed, but the tension in Loki's booth spiked. Fight 2, Otter vs. Eyest Wallenstein. Before Otter could leave the arena, the announcer's voice rang out again. Next up, Eyest Wallenstein, the Sword Princess. Eyest stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. She had been waiting for this moment. Her hatred for Freya Familia and her thirst for vengeance against those who stood in her way had reached a boiling point. Without a word, she leapt into the ring, her rapier flashing as she drew it. From the start, it was clear Eyest was different. The air around her crackled with unstable magical energy. Her rage fueled her, and the wind spirits that aided her seemed almost out of control. Eyest rushed at Otter with terrifying speed, her rapier slicing through the air, each strike filled with lethal intent. Otter, already tired from his fight with Finn, blocked the first few strikes but found himself struggling to keep up with Eyes' relentless assault. Her rage gave her strength, and her control over her wind magic grew erratic, creating gales that buffeted Otter and sent cracks spidering across the ground. With a final surge of power, Eyest unleashed her magic, Ariel, in an explosion of wind and fury that engulfed the arena. Otter roared, standing firm as he swung his sword to deflect the storm, but the force of Eyes' attack was too great. When the dust settled, both fighters were on their knees, barely conscious. Neither could continue. "A draw," the announcer declared, surprising the crowd. Fight 3, Bel Cranel vs. Reveria Ijos Alf. The announcer barely gave the crowd time to process the draw before the next name was called. Next, Freya Familia's ace, Bel Cranel, versus Loki Familia's elven sage, Reveria Ijos Alf. Bel rose calmly from his seat. His training had taken him beyond his previous limits, and he was more than ready to prove it. Reveria, calm and composed, knew that she had to give everything she had in this fight. The two descended into the arena as the audience hushed. Reveria opened with a barrage of high-level spells, her magic lighting up the arena as she unleashed a storm of fire, wind, and ice. But Bel, faster than the eye could track, dodged each attack, his 6 eyes allowing him to read the flow of magic before it even formed. Bel retaliated with an elegant sweep of his sword, followed by a series of high-speed strikes that forced Reveria to go on the defensive. Despite her skill, Bel's overwhelming speed and precision were too much. With a final burst of magic, Reveria tried to create space, but Bel slipped through her defenses and landed a decisive blow, knocking her unconscious. "Bel Cranel is victorious," the announcer cried, and the crowd roared even louder than before. Freya smiled proudly from her seat, her gaze locked onto her champion. Fight 4, Bel Cranel vs. Gareth Landrock. Next up was Gareth Landrock, Loki Familia's indomitable dwarf. Bel, however, had fought monsters stronger than any adventurer during his month of intense training. Gareth charged with a bellowing roar, his axe swinging with deadly force. But Bel, unfazed, ducked under each strike, his movements smooth and fluid. He countered with a flurry of blows, each one striking Gareth with precision. The dwarf swung wildly, but Bell was too fast, too sharp. A final strike to Gareth's midsection sent him crashing to the ground. Bell Cranel wins again. Fight 5. Bell Cranel vs. beat Loga, Tiona, and Tyon. Loki wanted to win at all cost, and desperate times call for desperate means. So after bribing the announcer, she sat in her seat and watched with a happy expression as her final card went towards the arena. Next came Beat, followed by the Amazon twins, Tiona and Tyon. But no matter their ferocity, no matter their skill, they all fell one by one to Bell's relentless assault. His mastery over his techniques, his strength, and his endless reserves of energy made him unbeatable. His limitless ability kept him untouchable, while his swordsmanship was flawless. With each fight, the gap between Bell and the other adventurers became clearer. He stood above them all. The final blow was struck, and the last of Loki Familia's fighters fell to the ground. The announcer raised his hands to the sky. Freya Familia is victorious. They are the strongest. Familia in Orario. The crowd erupted, and the entire stadium shook, with cheers and gasps. Freya, seated in her booth, gazed down at Bell with pride and satisfaction. Loki, silent and bitter, knew the cost of this defeat. Finn, Eyest, and Reveria and the others were now Freya's, as promised. Freya Familia had proven its dominance over Orario, and Bell Cranel had cemented his place as the strongest adventurer in the world. Bell Cranel walked through the bustling streets of Orario, his footsteps light but purposeful. It had only been a few days since the monumental war game between Freya Familia and Loki Familia, where he had secured his place as the strongest adventurer in Orario. Yet despite the praise, admiration, and the growing legend surrounding him, Bell found his mind unusually quiet. The thrill of battle had subsided, and he now found himself wandering the familiar streets, lost in thought. He glanced up at the sky, the golden hues of sunset casting long shadows across the stone streets. Orario, with all its grandeur, seemed almost peaceful, an illusion, of course, for the dungeon still loomed beneath, ever dangerous and alive. But for Bell, this peaceful moment was a brief respite. That's when he felt it, eyes on him. The sensation was subtle at first, but as Bell continued to walk, it grew stronger. His instincts, sharpened by countless battles, and enhanced by his 6 eyes, warned him that something, or someone, was watching him. Bell paused, his red eyes narrowing as he scanned the street. He turned sharply toward a narrow alleyway, the feeling growing stronger. Without hesitation, he followed the instinct, his feet guiding him through twisting streets until he reached a secluded part of the city. Standing there, in the shadow of a crumbling stone building, was a figure shrouded in darkness. The person's features were obscured by a hooded cloak, but Bell could feel their gaze locked onto him, sharp and piercing. Before Bell could speak, the figure moved within human speed. In a swirl of leaves and a gust of wind, they vanished, leaving only a letter behind, fluttering gently to the ground. Bell blinked, momentarily surprised. He bent down, picking up the letter. It was sealed with a symbol, a lightning bolt, encircled by an ancient wreath. Confused but intrigued, Bell pocketed the letter and returned to the Freya Familia manor. Later that evening, Bell sat comfortably in his room, with Freya nestled in his lap, her arms draped around him possessively. She had grown more affectionate since the war game, the bond between them deepening. As Bell's power grew, Freya, ever the goddess of beauty and desire, seemed content simply to be near him. "What's that, darling?" she asked, her voice soft and lilting, as her fingers traced idle patterns across his chest. Bell held up the letter, still sealed. "Someone handed this to me earlier. They disappeared before I could ask anything." Freya's violet eyes twinkled with curiosity as she sat up slightly. Looking at the mysterious envelope, Bell broke the seal and unfolded the parchment inside. As he read, his eyes widened, and Freya, sensing his sudden tension, leaned in closer, reading the contents. Over his shoulder. "To my dear grandson, Bell Cranel, it is with great urgency that I reach out to you, for I have been watching your progress, and it is time for you to know the truth about your origins. I am your grandfather, Zeus, the once great god of Orario. I regret that. I was forced to leave you when you were young, but the time has come for us to meet. You must also know that your grandmother, Hera, is alive as well. We have been in hiding, but now we need your help. There is something that requires your strength, something ancient, powerful, and deeply tied to the past of this world. I cannot say more in this letter, but I ask you to come to the village near Dragon Valley. You will understand when you arrive. This is not just a family matter. It is a threat that could change the fate of Orario and beyond. We wait you, Belle, and know that others await you as well. With love and respect, Zeus. Belle's breath caught in his throat as he finished reading the letter. Freya, ever perceptive, sat up fully, her expression growing serious. Zeus, she whispered, the god who once ruled Orario with his Familia. Belle nodded, still processing the shock. His thoughts raced. Zeus, his grandfather, the god who had raised him as a child, had always been a kindly old man to him, though he had left without a word when Belle was still young. And now, Hera, the legendary goddess who once ruled alongside Zeus, was his grandmother. Freya's eyes narrowed, her hand resting on Belle's arm. This could be a trap. Zeus and Hera were exiled from Orario after their failure with the one-eyed black dragon. Why would they surface now, and why do they need you? Belle frowned, turning the letter over in his hands. I don't know, but I need answers. If they really are my family, I can't ignore this. And if something dangerous is happening near Dragon Valley, it could affect all of Orario. Freya remained quiet for a moment, then sighed, her fingers gripping his arm slightly tighter. You'll go then? It wasn't a question. Belle nodded. I have to. Gaze softened, though the concern in her eyes remained. Then I'll let you go, but promise me you'll come back to me, Belle. She leaned forward, pressing her lips against his in a soft but lingering kiss. I promise, Belle whispered against her lips. The next day, Belle prepared for his journey to the village near Dragon Valley. He packed light, though his nerves were buzzing with anticipation. Freya, despite her usual confidence, seemed unusually quiet as she watched him gather his things. I'll come back, Belle reassured her, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. I know you will, Freya whispered, her hands resting on his chest. But don't underestimate this. Zeus and Hera are powerful gods, and the Dragon Valley is no ordinary place. Whatever they need from you, it's bound to be dangerous. Belle smiled faintly. When is anything ever not dangerous? Freya's smile was small but genuine, though her eyes still held a trace of worry. Just be careful, darling. I don't want to lose you. With one last look at her, Belle left the manor and began his journey. As Belle approached the small village near Dragon Valley, the landscape began to change. The peaceful fields of Orario gave way to more rugged terrain, with jagged mountains looming in the distance. The air felt different here, thicker, more ominous. Belle couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient lurked nearby. The village itself was quiet, almost eerily so. Few people wandered the streets, and those who did seemed wary, casting nervous glances toward the distant mountains where Dragon Valley lay. Belle approached a small inn at the edge of the village, his heart racing. He had no idea what to expect, but his instincts told him that whatever lay ahead was more than just a family reunion. As he pushed open the door to the inn, his senses went on high alert. And there, sitting at a corner table, were two figures, a tall, imposing man with a thick beard and bright, piercing eyes, and a regal woman with long, flowing hair and a gaze as sharp as a blade. Zeus and Hera. Belle's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, and his heart raced with the weight of the truth. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Belle Cranell stood at the threshold of destiny. The quiet village near Dragon Valley was a stark contrast to the bustling streets of Orario, but its silence held a weight that pressed down on his chest. He had come here to meet his family, his true family, the ones who had survived the legendary battles of the past. The small inn he had entered felt like the gateway to something far greater than he could ever have imagined. At the far corner of the room, seated at a modest wooden table, were two figures that radiated power and history. The first was a tall, imposing man with a thick beard streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. Zeus, his grandfather. The other, a regal woman, with an air of cold authority, was Hera, the goddess Bel had only heard whispers of. She held herself like an empress, her sharp gaze dissecting him as soon as he stepped inside. But it wasn't just them. Standing behind them, as if guarding them, were others, 2 men, and a woman. The woman was strikingly familiar. She had a quiet, fierce beauty that reminded Bel of Alfia, the woman whose powers he had inherited. This woman, however, was very much alive. Her sharp eyes narrowed as they met his, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Alfia, Bel whispered, his heart thudding in his chest. Next to her stood 2 men. One, with a thick, muscular frame and scars crisscrossing his face, radiated an aura of sheer battle-hardened strength. Zold, Bel realized. The infamous Zold, captain of Hera Familia and one of the few who had once stood against the Black Dragon and lived. The other man was Lena, with a hawk-like gaze and an air of cold precision, Metis, captain of Zeus Familia. Bel swallowed hard. He was standing in the presence of legends. Come closer, Bel, Zeus called, his voice a deep rumble that resonated through the quiet room. Bel approached, his steps careful, almost reverent. Zeus gestured for him to sit, and Bel took a seat at the table, his mind still trying to grasp the reality of the situation. You look just like them, Alfia said softly, her eyes softening for a moment as she studied him. Your parents. Bel's breath hitched. He had never known his parents, but to hear Alfia speak of his parents stirred something deep within him. Zeus leaned forward, his expression serious. You're here because we need your help, Bel. But before we explain, you need to know the truth about us, about the 3 great quests and the Black Dragon. Hera nodded, her regal features hardening as she began to speak. We're the ones who led the charge against the Behemoth and Leviathan. We defeated them, but when it came time to face the Black Dragon, we weren't strong enough. The Black Dragon wiped out our familiars, Zeus Familia, Hera Familia. Only a few of us survived. We watched our comrades die, Zold growled, his voice low and filled with bitterness. The captains, the heroes, everyone. It was a massacre. Alfia crossed her arms, her gaze turning steely. And the worst part, the Black Dragon isn't dead. It's sealed, deep within the Dragon Valley, waiting for the seal to weaken. When it breaks free, there will be no stopping it unless you, Bel, Zeus finished, can surpass us, surpass the heroes of our time. Bel's heart pounded in his chest. He had always dreamed of being a hero, of surpassing even his wildest limits, but to hear that the fate of the world might rest on his shoulders felt overwhelming. We need your strength, Metis said, his hawk-like eyes narrowing. But you're not ready yet, not for what's coming. That's why we're going to train you. We'll teach you everything we know, everything that made us the strongest in our time. Zeus leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Bel. You'll learn to become more than just a powerful adventurer. You'll become a hero, a real one. Bel nodded slowly, determination hardening in his chest. He had come this far, grown so much since his early days in Orario, but this was something more, something bigger. If he truly wanted to protect those he loved, Freya, his familia, his friends, he needed to reach a level beyond anything he had ever imagined. When do we start? Bel asked, his voice steady. A smile broke out across Zeus' face. That's my boy. The training was brutal, far more intense than anything Bel had ever experienced. Over the next several months, he was pushed to his absolute limits, both mentally and physically. He trained every single day with Alfia, Zold, Metis, and his grandfather, learning the techniques and skills that had allowed them to stand against the greatest threats the world had ever known. Alfia focused on his magic, honing his control over Alfia's destructive spells and enhancing his abilities with limitless. She taught him to weave spells faster, to manipulate magical energy with precision so fine that he could disrupt enemy spells or reinforce his body to near invincibility. Zold and Metis trained his body and mind, teaching him how to fight like a true warrior. Bell learned the ancient combat techniques that heroes of old had perfected, how to channel magic into his strikes to cause internal destruction, how to break an enemy's guard, and how to fight with perfect efficiency. Zold's brutal training broke his body down and rebuilt it, while Metis sharpened his mind, teaching him tactics and strategies that made him a more dangerous, thinking warrior. Zeus, for his part, focused on Bell's growth as a leader. The old god instilled in him the wisdom of leadership, teaching him how to remain calm under pressure, how to make decisions that could change the course of battle and of history. Through this grueling training, Bell matured. His boyish charm was still there, but it was now accompanied by a sense of dominance and command. He had become decisive, strong-willed, and unyielding. His body grew more powerful, his mind sharper, and his heart more steadfast. But despite all the changes, Bell remained a hero at heart. He had not lost the light that made him who he was, the desire to protect others, to be the shield between his loved ones and the darkness that threatened them. Finally, after months of training, the day arrived. Bell stood with Zeus, Hera, Alfia, Zold, and Metis at the entrance to Dragon Valley. The mountains loomed before them, jagged and menacing, the air thick with the power of ancient magic. "This is it," Zeus said, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. "The black dragon is sealed deep within. Once we break the seal, there's no turning back." Bell nodded, his red eyes blazing with determination. His body was stronger than it had ever been, his mind sharper, and his magic now a force of nature. He was ready. "We're with you, Bell," Alfia said, stepping up beside him. Her eyes were filled with pride. "But you're the one who has to lead us to victory." Bell's gaze swept across the group, the legends who had once stood as the strongest, and now stood with him. He took a deep breath and clenched his fists. "I'll finish what you started," Bell said firmly. "And I'll protect everything I care about." With that, they began their descent into Dragon Valley, where the black dragon waited, sealed, but not for long. Bell Cranel, the hero forged in the fires of a new age, was ready to face the greatest threat the world had ever known. Bell Cranel and his group stood at the edge of Dragon Valley, staring down into the abyss that stretched endlessly before them. The valley was vast, its jagged cliffs and molten rivers glowing with the eerie light of ancient magic. The air was thick with tension, as if the land itself remembered the horrors that lay sealed beneath. "Gods," Hera whispered, her usually composed face tight with unease. "We're close." Zeus nodded, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the terrain. Below, too close. But it wasn't the oppressive atmosphere of the valley that captured their attention. No, it was the horde of monsters swarming the valley floor, creatures unlike anything Bell had seen before. Hundreds of thousands of them, scaled beasts, draconic in nature, their crimson eyes glowing with a hunger for destruction. Massive wings beat the air, tails swung like wrecking balls, and jagged teeth glistened in the dim light. "These are all dragons," Alfia muttered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the horde. Zold, standing beside her, grunted. "It's like they've been waiting for us." Bell's eyes were alight with a fiery determination. He took a deep breath, and a grin, the kind that signaled the arrival of a battle-hungry warrior, spread across his face. His hand instinctively reached for the hilt of his katana, the blade shimmering with magical energy as he unsheathed it with a whisper of steel. "Bell?" Alfia asked, concern creeping into her voice. The others turned to him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Without taking his eyes off the valley filled with dragons, Bell stepped forward, his muscles coiled like a spring. "I'll go. Test my skills against these dragons." Hera raised an eyebrow, alarm flashing in her usually cool gaze. "What are you intending to do, Bell?" she asked, her tone sharp. "We need to stay together." Zeus gave a deep chuckle, recognizing the spark in his grandson's eyes. "Let him. Hera. He needs this." Bell smirked, the thrill of battle coursing through his veins as he approached the cliff's edge. His heart raced, not with fear, but with exhilaration. He wanted, no, needed, to see how far he had come. The past months of relentless training, of pushing himself beyond every limit he had ever known, were about to be put to the ultimate test. He cast a glance back at the group, Alfia, Zold, Hera, Zeus, and the others, who had come to care for him. "I'll be fine," he said confidently. "Just watch." Then, with a single leap, Bel launched himself off the cliff, diving headfirst into the mass of dragonic monsters. Below, he soared through the air like a comet, his katana held firmly in his grip, the blade crackling with magical energy. The dragons roared as they sensed his approach, but Bel was faster. He landed with a crash, the force of his impact sending shockwaves through the valley floor. In an instant, his katana was a blur of motion, cutting through scales and flesh like they were nothing. Each swing of his blade was precise, deadly, and filled with an almost artistic grace. He weaved between the dragon's attacks effortlessly, his movements fluid and controlled. But as the minutes passed, the dragon's numbers became overwhelming. Despite their individual weakness compared to Bel's overwhelming power, they swarmed him like an unrelenting tide. Claws, fangs, and fire breath rained down on him from all directions. Still, Bel grinned, the thrill of combat fueling him as he cut down every monster that came within reach. Yet, after what felt like an eternity of hacking, slashing, and obliterating wave after wave of dragons, Bel's excitement began to fade. These creatures, while fierce and terrifying, were not the challenge he craved. His movements became more measured, more efficient. He was growing tired, not from exertion, but from the lack of worthy opponents. "Too weak," he muttered under his breath. Then, with a single powerful swing, Bel released a compressed air slash from his katana, a wave of devastating energy that ripped through the valley. The force of the attack was immense, cleaving through the majority of the dragon horde in one stroke. The ground beneath them shook, and a deep rumble echoed through the valley as the dragons crumbled to the ground, their bodies torn apart by the sheer power of Bel's attack. The valley fell silent for a moment, the battlefield now littered with the corpses of countless monsters. Bel stood amidst the carnage, his katana resting at his side, steam rising from his body as his breath came out in slow, steady puffs. And then, from the depths of the valley, a shadow began to move. Bel's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face it. The others, who had just reached the valley floor, saw it too, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh. The black dragon, its massive form blotted out the horizon, towering over everything in sight. Its scales were as black as the void, shimmering with an unnatural light. Its eyes burned with an ancient hatred, and its wings, vast and powerful, stretched out like the wings of death itself. It let out a deafening roar that shook the very earth, and with one slow, deliberate movement, the beast stepped forward, crushing the remains of its dragonic minions beneath its claws. Alfia, Zold, and the rest of the group rushed to Bel's side, their expressions grave. "By the gods," Zold whispered, his usually stoic demeanor faltering. "It's even more terrifying than I remember." Hera's hands began to glow with divine power as she and Zeus stepped forward. Together, they raised their arms, and the massive seal that had kept the black dragon contained for centuries became visible. It hovered above the beast, crackling with power. With a single gesture, Hera and Zeus shattered the seal. The valley trembled as the magic that had kept the dragon imprisoned was undone. The black dragon let out another roar, this time more feral, more enraged. Its eyes blazed as it swiped its massive claw through the air, tearing through the ravine like it was nothing but paper. The sheer force of its attack sent shockwaves rippling through the earth, forcing Bel and the others to leap back. Bel's heart pounded in his chest as he steadied himself, his katana still glowing with residual energy. He had faced many powerful enemies in his life, monsters, adventurers, even gods. But this was different. This was the black dragon, the very embodiment of destruction. The group formed a tight line, their faces set in grim determination. There was no turning back now. "This is it," Zeus said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and resolve. The final battle between adventurers and one of the great beasts. Bel nodded, his grip tightening on his katana. His heart raced with anticipation, but his mind was calm. He had trained for this. He was ready. The standoff between adventurers and the apocalyptic beast began. and the fate of the world rested on the outcome. The atmosphere was thick with tension as the team of adventurers stood on the barren battlefield of Dragon Valley. Bel Cranel, his katana still stained with the blood of lesser dragonic monsters, felt his heartbeat thrum in his ears. His comrades, Alfia, Zold, Hera, Zeus, and the two former captains of the Zeus and Hera familias, stood around him, each bearing the weight of centuries of history. The towering presence of the black dragon loomed over them, casting a shadow that felt both physical and existential. Its ebony scales shimmered with an unnatural light, a testament to the unholy power it wielded. As Bel's eyes locked with the creature's remaining eye, blazing with an ancient, burning hatred, he couldn't help but recall the stories he had heard of the one-eyed black dragon. It was the tale of a nightmare-given form, a creature that had survived since the dawn of time, long before the gods descended to Gokai. The black dragon had once been a force of nature, scouring the lands of men and gods alike. Its cruelty knew no bounds. It burned cities to ash, sundered mountains with a swipe of its claw, and left entire armies shattered in its wake. The black dragon had become the greatest threat to the world, the indomitable beast that even the mightiest heroes of the Zeus and Hera familias could not defeat. Its most terrifying power, immortality. No matter how many wounds it suffered, how many of its limbs were severed, it would always regenerate. It was unstoppable. The final quest, where the remnants of the Zeus and Hera familia had fought the beast, had ended in failure. Most of their legendary adventurers perished, and those who survived were scarred, both physically and mentally. The black dragon had since been sealed in Dragon Valley, awaiting the day when it would be unleashed once more. Today was that day. Dark breath incoming. Bel yelled, breaking from his thoughts as the black dragon reared its head. The sky above them turned a deep, unnatural shade of purple, swirling as the dragon inhaled. In the next moment, a torrent of dark energy erupted from its maw, black flames, laced with malevolent magic rushing toward the group. The sheer size and speed of the attack were overwhelming. Move! Bel shouted. Each adventurer dodged with practiced precision, rolling and flipping away as the attack scorched the earth where they had stood moments before. The heat was unbearable, the force of the flames shaking the ground beneath their feet. Up above, the gods, Zeus, Hera, and Alfia, watched from a safe vantage point atop a cliff. Bound by the divine restrictions placed on them in the mortal realm, they were unable to directly intervene. Bel, Hera whispered under her breath, her heart heavy with worry. She clenched her hands, unable to tear her eyes away from the battlefield. Zeus stood beside her, his expression grim as he watched his grandson take charge. "Don't die on us, kid," Zeus muttered, though there was a trace of pride in his voice. Bel, regaining his balance, quickly assessed the situation. His instincts screamed at him to act, and his mind worked furiously to formulate a strategy. He turned to the others, his voice firm. "Everyone, aim for its limbs. We need to cripple it before we can finish it off. It can't retaliate if we take out its mobility," he ordered. Without hesitation, the adventurers sprang into action. Zold, Alfia, and the others darted toward the dragon, each targeting a different limb. Zold swung his mighty sword at one of the creature's legs, while Alfia fired off powerful spells aimed at its wings. The captains of Zeus and Hera Familia struck at its tail and remaining eye with all their strength. With precision and ferocity, they attacked, managing to sever the dragon's leg and damage its wings. The massive beast roared in agony, its body thrashing as it struggled to regain balance. But just as Bel thought they had succeeded, the truth hit them like a crashing wave. The wounds were healing. "What?" Alfia gasped, her voice laced with disbelief. Bel's eyes widened in horror as the black dragon's severed leg began to regrow, its wings stitching themselves back together. The regeneration was almost instantaneous. The beast's missing eye remained a hollow socket, but the rest of its injuries vanished as if they had never existed. "What kind of cheat is that?" Bel roared in frustration, slamming his katana into the ground. Desperation clawed at him as he watched the monster heal, mocking their efforts. He needed something stronger, something more devastating. His mind raced, and then an idea hit him. There was one thing left to try. something he had learned but never used against. Such a powerful foe. Raising his hand, Bell gathered energy into his palm, focusing all of his power into a single attack. He aimed for the beast's one vulnerable point, its missing eye. Red! Bell shouted, releasing the powerful magical energy in a single, focused beam. The energy shot forward like a crimson bullet, striking the black dragon in its hollow eye socket. The reaction was immediate. The dragon roared in anguish, its massive body convulsing as the blast tore into its very being. Bell's attack had bypassed the creature's regeneration, striking at its core. The dragon thrashed wildly, swinging its claws in blind fury. One of its massive talons raked through the air, catching Zold's arm, and tearing it open with a sickening sound. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Zold didn't falter. Instead, he charged forward, using his last reserves of strength to strike back at the beast. For days, the battle raged on. The adventurers fought with everything they had, their bodies battered and broken. Zold, Alfia, and the two captains of Zeus and Hera's Familia held nothing back. But despite their best efforts, the Black Dragon's regeneration proved an insurmountable challenge. It was relentless, and every strike they landed felt like a drop in the ocean. Finally, the two captains, wounded beyond recovery, made the ultimate sacrifice. With their final breaths, they channeled their fauna, their very souls, into Bell. Their power surged into him, their levels and experience transferring to the young hero. Zold, who had fought valiantly despite his grievous injuries, followed suit, passing his level 7 strength to Bell as well. Bell screamed in agony as their power merged with his own. His fauna swelled, pushing him to the brink of his limits. Level after level, he ascended, gaining strength far beyond anything he had ever known. But even with this newfound power, the Black Dragon fought on, its regeneration slowing but not stopping entirely. Bell was exhausted, his body burning with fatigue, and the weight of his fallen comrades pressed heavily on his heart. Standing shoulder to shoulder with Alfia, the last survivor at his side, Bell gritted his teeth in frustration. They couldn't mourn. They couldn't rest. Not while this abomination still lived. There's only one option left, Bell muttered, his voice hoarse. Alfia turned to him, her eyes widening as she saw the determination in his gaze. What are you going to do? Bell held out his left hand, his fingers trembling from the sheer strain of the battle. Alfia, he said quietly, hold on to me. And don't let go, no matter what. Confused but trusting him, Alfia placed her hand on his shoulder, gripping tightly. Bell's hand began to glow with an eerie blue light, a light that seemed to warp the very space around them. His voice echoed through the valley, a declaration that would change the tide of the battle. Domain expansion, infinite void. Asphere of infinite. Space expanded from Bell, trapping the Black Dragon within its boundaries. The dragon roared in confusion and fury, unable to comprehend the incomprehensible. Within the domain, time and space blurred, and reality itself became a maze of sensations and nothingness. Bell took a deep breath, his eyes glowing with fierce intensity. He made a binding vow in that moment, sacrificing his ability to use blue and red for the weak, and limiting his magic reserves to 45%. In exchange, he gained the power to rapid-fire hollow purple, a technique that fused both energies into devastating blasts. Bell grinned as he held his palm out toward the immobilized dragon. His hand crackled with energy, and the air around him pulsed with power. Let's end this, he said through gritted teeth. One after another, Bell unleashed hollow purple, each blast infused with the power of 3 black flashes. The intensity of each strike tore into the Black Dragon, rending its flesh and soul alike. The creature, once a force of unstoppable destruction, was now reduced to a writhing, agonized shadow of its former self. As the final hollow purple shot forth, Bell watched as the Black Dragon crumbled, its regeneration finally defeated. It let out one last roar of defiance before it fell silent, its massive form disintegrating into nothingness. Bell stood there, panting heavily, his body trembling from the sheer exertion. The battlefield was quiet. The dragon was dead. He had avenged the fallen. The Black Dragon, the nightmare of Orario, was no more. And Bel Cranel stood as the greatest hero the world had ever seen. Bel awoke slowly, the world around him quiet and still, a stark contrast to the chaos that had nearly consumed him just days ago. His body felt heavy, every muscle aching from the prolonged battle against the Black Dragon. He shifted slightly and winced, the toll of the fight still evident in every movement. As he opened his eyes fully, he saw Alfia sitting beside him, her usually composed expression softened with a mixture of concern and exhaustion. She had barely left his side since the battle, her protective instincts, both as an adventurer and as his aunt, keeping her close. "You're awake," Alfia said softly, her voice betraying just a hint of relief. Bel nodded, his throat dry as he tried to find his voice. "How long was I out?" "A few days," she replied. "You pushed yourself beyond your limits, but you did it. The Black Dragon is gone." Bel took a deep breath, letting the weight of that statement sink in. They had won, but at a great cost. His thoughts immediately went to those they had lost: Zold, the captains of Zeus and Hera, Familia, and so many others who had given everything in the fight against the apocalyptic beast. The weight of their sacrifice pressed down on him like a heavy mantle, and for a moment, the victory felt hollow. Alfia seemed to sense his thoughts, her hand resting on his shoulder. They fought knowing the risks, Bel. They believed in the cause. In you. Bel clenched his fists, fighting the tears that threatened to well up. "I wish I could have saved them." Alfia's gaze softened even more, and for the first time, Bel saw the pain in her eyes too. She had known these people for years, perhaps centuries, and their loss had struck her deeply. But she was stronger now, her bond with Bel providing her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. "We mourn them," she said quietly, "but we also honor them by moving forward." That's what they would have wanted. Bel looked at her, feeling the deepening connection between them. They were family, something that had become more than just a word to him. In the aftermath of everything, Alfia had become not just a mentor or a distant figure from his past, but someone he could rely on, someone he could trust completely. They sat together in silence for a while, letting the weight of their shared grief and survival settle between them. Finally, Bel spoke again, his voice low. "I won't forget them. Any of them." Alfia nodded, her hand squeezing his shoulder gently. "Neither will I." A week later, after Bel had recovered enough strength to stand without feeling like his legs would buckle, the group held a proper send-off ceremony for their fallen comrades. The air was filled with the scent of incense and the sound of quiet murmurs as Zeus, Hera, and Alfia led the somber gathering. The bodies of Zold and the others had been laid to rest in the valley, their graves marked with simple stones. It was a tradition from their era, one that spoke of the honor in returning to the earth after a life of battle. Bel stood at the edge of the ceremony, his heart heavy but his resolve stronger than ever. As the flames from the pyres flickered, casting shadows over the solemn faces of those gathered, Bel whispered a silent promise to himself and to the fallen. He would carry their strength, their memories, with him, and he would not let their sacrifice be in vain. Alfia stood beside him throughout the ceremony, her presence steady and comforting. She, too, had lost much in this battle, but she was not one to let grief consume her. Together, they mourned, bonded more deeply by the shared loss, and Bel felt a renewed sense of purpose burning in his chest. The week passed, and soon it was time to return to Orario. As Bel, Zeus, Hera, and Alfia made their way through the bustling streets of the city, they were met with curious and sometimes fearful gazes. The gods who had once ruled supreme in Orario had returned, and their mere presence brought with it a wave of tension. The air was thick with unspoken questions, but no one dared to approach them. It wasn't until the news of their victory against the Black Dragon began to spread that the tone of the city shifted. Whispers of admiration replaced the fear, and soon, cheers erupted as people realized what had truly happened. The Black Dragon, the nightmare that had haunted Orario for generations, was dead. And Bel Cranel, the young adventurer who had surpassed all expectations, was hailed as the hero who had led the charge. But Bel's mind wasn't on the celebrations that erupted in the city. His Thoughts were fixed on one person in particular, Freya. When they finally reached her temple, Belle found her waiting for him with a look of both relief and anticipation. She ran toward him, her arms wrapping around him tightly as she pressed herself against him. Her lips found his in a passionate kiss, and for a moment all the exhaustion, the pain, and the grief melted away. "You're back," she whispered against his lips, her voice filled with emotion. "I'm back," Belle replied, holding her close. The warmth of her embrace, the soft feel of her lips, it grounded him in a way that nothing else could. Freya, with her divine beauty and intoxicating allure, had promised him more than just power. She had promised him a life of passion, of devotion. And now, as they stood together, Belle knew he had returned to more than just Orario. He had returned to her. That night, Belle found himself in Freya's quarters, where she had prepared a feast unlike any other. But it wasn't the food that had Belle's attention. It was Freya herself and the surprising company she had gathered. Freya had not forgotten her promise. As Belle sat down, Freya, with a mischievous glint in her eye, introduced him to the goddesses she had called upon. Demeter, with her radiant figure and heavenly curves, stood to his right, her soft smile both warm and inviting. Hephaestus, her athletic body and fiery red hair framing her beautiful face, gave Belle a challenging look, as if daring him to keep up. Loki, with her mischievous smirk and that wondrously dangerous glint in her eyes, looked ready to cause some trouble. And then, to Belle's shock, came the final goddess to join them. Hera herself, regal and beautiful, stood at the far end of the room, her presence commanding attention. She met Belle's wide-eyed gaze with a soft smile, her voice smooth as she said, "I thought it only fitting that I join this celebration, given everything you've done." Belle blinked, trying to process the sight of Hera standing there, and then he felt Freya's hands slide around his shoulders, her lips brushing his ear. "I promised you a reward, didn't I?" she whispered, her voice a seductive purr. "Tonight is your night." Belle. With a mixture of awe and excitement, Belle let the moment wash over him. He didn't need details to understand what was coming. Surrounded by goddesses who adored him, he knew this night would be one of passion, affection, and love. For a moment, Belle let himself be swept away in the divine embrace of the goddesses, the weight of the world and the battles fought far behind him. At least for now, he was simply Belle Cranel, the hero who had earned his reward, a reward he will most certainly enjoy to its fullest. Belle Cranel had been on countless quests over the past few months. Freya had sent him on missions across the world, cementing her Familia's status as the most formidable in Orario. His reputation had grown far beyond the city's borders. From the frozen tundras of the far north to the sun-scorched deserts of the southern kingdoms, Belle had seen it all. He had fought alongside elves, dwarfs, beastmen, and humans alike, making alliances and earning the respect of the various races and cultures scattered across the land. Though each mission was officially meant to bolster Freya Familia's prestige, Belle knew there was something more. A secret mission from the gods themselves, something hidden behind veils of divine intent. But he did not question it. His trust in Freya, and the gods who now watched him so closely, was unwavering. Belle completed each task with the same determination and focus that had carried him through every challenge. Now, after months of travel and adventure, Belle was back in Orario. The city buzzed with excitement. Rumors of his exploits had spread like wildfire, and people whispered about the hero who had bested monsters and enemies far beyond the dungeon's depths. But Belle's mind was elsewhere. He had barely returned when he received a summons from Freya, calling him to an urgent meeting of Orario's most powerful Familia leaders. The room was filled with tension. The captains and vice-captains of the most powerful Familias in Orario had gathered, along with their gods and goddesses. Zeus and Hera stood side by side with Freya, while Loki lounged in her chair, her eyes darting between the other deities with sharp curiosity. Findaimna, captain of Loki Familia, stood near his goddess, his expression serious. Otter, the towering captain of Freya Familia, leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed over his chest. Belle could feel the intensity in the air, as if each person in the room knew something monumental was coming. Freya, seated at the head of the table, spoke first. Thank you all for coming. We have much to discuss. Loki raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a grin. Oh, this sounds juicy. What's got the goddess of beauty so serious? Freya's silver eyes glinted, unamused by Loki's jest. The dungeon. That one word was enough to silence the entire room. Every adventurer, every god and goddess knew the power and danger that the dungeon held. But the way Freya said it, with a mix of apprehension and certainty, sent a chill down Bel's spine. Zeus, his presence commanding despite his age, nodded gravely. Something stirs in its depths. Hera spoke next. Her voice as regal and authoritative as always. The dungeon is not just a place of monsters. There's something more within it, something ancient, an entity. We believe it's tied to the very nature of the dungeon itself. Finn frowned. An entity? What do you mean by that? Freya leaned forward. It's not just a mindless creation like the monsters we've faced. This entity is sentient. We've known for some time that the dungeon has an almost reactive quality. But recently, there have been signs that it's not just reacting. It's planning. Bel felt his heart race. The thought of something intelligent guiding the dungeon was terrifying. But more than that, it was an unknown threat, one that none of them had prepared for. Loki, uncharacteristically serious now, tapped her fingers against the table. And you think it's time for us to deal with it? Freya nodded. We can't wait any longer. The dungeon's power is growing, and if we don't act soon, it could overwhelm Orario. Or worse, escape its confines. Zeus stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. We need to prepare for a full-scale assault on the dungeon. Every Familia, every adventurer will need to take part in this. It's the only way. There was a murmur of agreement, though the tension was still palpable. Even the strongest adventurers in Orario knew that such a mission was unlike anything they had ever faced. The dungeon had always been a place of danger, but it was something they could manage. Now, it seemed as though it had evolved into a living, breathing entity of chaos. Bel, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. How deep do we have to go? Freya turned her gaze to him, her eyes softening. Just a little. All the way. To the very bottom. And we must eliminate whatever this entity is. There was a long pause as everyone in the room absorbed the enormity of the task ahead of them. Then Finn, always the strategist, stepped forward. We'll need a plan. If we're going to take the dungeon by storm, we can't just rush in. We need teams, strategy, coordination. He looked around the room, his sharp mind already working out the details. We'll divide our forces by floors, clearing each one systematically. Captains will lead their squads, and we'll have healers and support teams stationed at key points to reinforce us. No one fights alone. Otter grunted his approval, his voice a deep rumble. We need to keep the pressure on. If we let up, the dungeon will overwhelm us. Loki sighed dramatically but nodded. In agreement. Looks like we're all in for the ride of our lives. Freya stood, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. We have 1 month to prepare. Train, strengthen your forces, and be ready. When the time comes, we will descend into the dungeon and end this once and for all. The meeting adjourned, and the city of Orario buzzed with the news of the upcoming assault. Adventurers from all Familia were preparing themselves for the largest dungeon crawl in history. It wasn't just a mission anymore, it was a war. Bel spent the next weeks training relentlessly. Freya Familia was already the strongest, but Bel knew they couldn't afford any weaknesses. He sparred with Otter, strategized with Finn, and pushed his body and mind to the limits. Freya watched over him, her pride in him growing with every passing day. Soon, the time came. The adventurers of Orario, united under one cause, gathered at the entrance to the dungeon. Thousands of them, from all Familia, stood, ready to march into the depths. The gods and goddesses watched. From above, their expressions a mixture of hope and fear. Bel stood at the front, alongside Finn, Otter, and the other captains. His hand rested on the hilt of his katana, his eyes fixed on the dark entrance. Ahead, he could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. But he also felt a fierce determination. The dungeon had always been a place of danger and opportunity. But now, it was something more. It was a battlefield, and Bel Cranel was ready to face whatever lay within its depths. As the gates to the dungeon opened, Bel took a deep breath. The time had come. Orario would face its greatest challenge yet, and he would lead the charge. Flashback, the day before the descent. The grand hall of the Pantheon was filled with some of the most powerful and revered figures in all of Orario. Bel Cranel sat at the head of a long table, his gaze sharp as he studied the magical diagrams and notes scattered across the surface. Surrounding him were the leaders of the most magically gifted adventurers and the gods and goddesses who specialized in magic, mystery, and sealing. Freya sat at his side, her eyes filled with both pride and curiosity. Across from her, Loki leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, while Hecate, goddess of magic, looked intrigued. Several other gods and goddesses of arcane arts, like Hermes, Demeter, and Hephaestus, had also gathered. Sealing off the dungeon floor by floor, Loki began, tapping her fingers on the table. "It's not something anyone's ever done before, kid." Bel nodded, his expression serious. "Exactly. The monsters spawn endlessly, and the dungeon itself seems almost alive, but if we can block off each floor, as we pass through it, we can stop them from respawning behind us. That way, we can make sure they don't overwhelm us from the rear as we descend deeper." Hecate, her voice as deep and mystical as the night, spoke next. "Sealing magic on that scale, especially in the dungeon, will be incredibly draining. Are you prepared for that?" Bel placed his hand on the table, releasing a pulse of magic that caused the room to tremble for a moment. "I've been training for this. I can handle it." Hermes leaned forward, his mischievous smile slipping for once as he considered the gravity of the situation. "And if it doesn't work? If the seals break or the dungeon finds a way to circumvent them?" Freya interjected before Bel could answer, her gaze intense. "It will work. Bel's magic is unique, and he's capable of adapting in ways we can't predict. If anyone can succeed in sealing off each floor, it's him." Hephaestus, who had been quiet until now, cleared her throat. "The real question is what we'll find once we reach the lowest depths. There's something more dangerous than monsters waiting for us down there." Bel's eyes hardened. "That's why we're doing this. We need to control the situation as much as we can before we reach the bottom." Loki sighed, rubbing the back of her head. "Well, it's worth a shot. But you better be ready, Bel. No one's ever made it past Floor 82. What lies beyond is uncharted territory." The discussion continued late into the night as the gods, goddesses, and adventurers fine-tuned their plan. Hecate, Freya, and other magic deities would provide Bel with additional magical tools to strengthen the seals. But the weight of the mission rested on his shoulders. Present day, the descent. Bel's eyes scanned the dark stone walls of the dungeon as his group descended another flight of stairs, entering floor 60. Behind him, the members of Freya, Familia, and the elite adventurers of Loki. Familia moved with practiced precision, their weapons drawn and eyes alert. Every few floors, they had paused to clear out the monsters, methodically eliminating every threat before Bel and the magic users sealed the area off. Bel walked calmly at the front, his hand resting on the hilt of the divine weapon strapped to his back. Crafted by Hephaestus and infused with the essence of several god-slaying artifacts, it was a blade unlike any other, a weapon meant to end whatever dwelled in the deepest depths of the dungeon. Poison so potent that no mortal or immortal creature could withstand them had been woven into the blade's very metal. Freya's voice broke through the tense silence. "The next floor should be a safe zone. We'll rest there before continuing." The group descended another level, and Bel sent out a pulse of magic, his senses spreading out in all directions. His eyes narrowed slightly as he felt the layout of the floor shift in his mind. "No abnormalities," he confirmed, "just the usual monster spawns ahead." At that, the group surged forward, weapons flashing as they cut through the oncoming wave of monsters. Otter led the charge, his massive axe cleaving through the larger monsters, while Eyest and Gareth dispatched the smaller ones with swift precision. It had become routine over the past few weeks. Clear, seal, rest, repeat. Finally, They reached the safe zone, and Bell raised his hand. The air shimmered around them as a barrier of intricate runes spread. From his fingertips, enveloping the entire floor, the seal snapped into place with a faint hum of magic. Sealed, Bell said, exhaling slowly, even though he had grown accustomed to the strain of sealing magic. The deeper they went, the harder it became to keep up the pace. Eyest sat down near him, wiping her blade clean. We're halfway there. Bell nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. They had reached floor 82, the last known floor anyone had explored. From here, every step was a venture into the unknown. A month later, floor 82, the adventurers stood in front of the staircase leading to floor 83, tension thick in the air. Bell stood at the edge, his magic already spread out like a net, scanning the area below for any sign of danger. This is it, Otter rumbled, his voice low. No one's been beyond this point. Bell, his katana gleaming in the dim light, closed his eyes and extended his senses further. He could feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the deep rumble of the dungeon's structure as if it were alive. There's something down there, he said quietly, something different. The remaining adventurers stood with bated breath as they descended. For the first time, Bell had them all on high alert. They were in uncharted territory now, and no one knew what to expect. As they reached floor 83, Bell's pulse of magic detected strange movements. He halted the group and turned to his companions, Otter, Eyest, Finn, Gareth, and the other level 7s and higher. There are abnormalities ahead, Bell explained. Monsters we haven't encountered before. They are faster, stronger, and they are converging on us. Otter gripped his axe tighter. Then we'll also move faster. Bell nodded but stepped back slightly. I'll hold back for now. You all handle what's in front of us. I'll save my power for when things get critical. They moved swiftly, clearing the floor with deadly efficiency. But the deeper they went, the stronger the resistance became. New monsters, larger and more fearsome than anything they had faced before, poured from the shadows. Bell's pulse of magic detected something else, a vast, swirling energy below them. Whatever lay in the deepest depths of the dungeon was waiting, and it was powerful. As they descended deeper into the dungeon, Bell couldn't help but think of the gift the gods had given him before the mission began. The divine weapon strapped to his back hummed with energy, crafted from the strongest god-slaying artifacts in existence, imbued with poisons that could kill even the immortal. And beyond that, Bell had been trained in divine swordsmanship and martial arts by the gods themselves. His movements had become sharper, faster, more precise. His magic, already formidable, had grown in ways he had never imagined. You're ready for this, Freya had told him the night before the descent. The gods have given you everything you need to succeed. Now it's time for you to use it. Bell's hand tightened on the hilt of his weapon as they approached the final staircase. I'll win, he whispered to himself. As the last seal snapped into place behind them, the adventurers stood at the precipice of the unknown. The standoff between them and the entity at the bottom of the dungeon was about to begin. And Bell Crannel would be the one to bring it to an end. The 90th floor of the dungeon was a place of suffocating darkness, where the air itself seemed thick with menace. Every step down into the lower floors brought an increased sense of dread, and yet, for Bell and his companions, it felt like just another step in their relentless pursuit of power. The walls here were damp, the stone crumbling in places, as if the very dungeon itself was decaying from within. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, Bell Crannel walked in silence behind Finn, Riveria, and Otter, seemingly unbothered by the growing danger. For the past few floors, it was Finn's sharp tactics, Riveria's devastating spells, and Otter's overwhelming strength that had led the charge. Bell had stayed back, allowing them to take point while he observed. Always watching, always learning. His Familia members walked alongside him, ready to jump in if needed, but the battle-hardened trio at the front handled everything the dungeon could throw at them. They were the best of Orario, level 6s and 7s who had seen more blood and battle than most could ever imagine. But even they were beginning to feel the weight of the endless onslaught. Finn was the first to pause, his short blonde hair slick with sweat, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. His spear rested at his side, the tip glinting faintly in the dim light. "Reveria, Otter," Finn said. Quietly, "let's take a short break here." The three of them slowed to a stop, the silence after the recent battles ringing in their ears. Otter stood like a towering wall of muscle, his stoic expression betraying nothing, but his breathing was slightly heavier, a sign of the intense battles they'd just endured. Reveria, ever graceful, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow and lowered her staff, her magic reserves still plentiful but slowly depleting. Bell, walking up behind them, nodded as they found a suitable resting spot. His Familia, too, gathered around him. They had faced countless monsters, fought their way deeper into the dungeon than anyone thought possible, and yet, Bell's energy seemed boundless. Reveria glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You've been awfully quiet, Bell. Are you going to just watch us the entire way down?" Bell chuckled softly, his crimson eyes glowing in the dim light. "I figured you could use the warm-up." Otter grunted, crossing his arms. "It's time for you to fight too." Finn looked at Bell, his sharp mind already calculating the situation. "We're about to hit the 100th floor soon. If there's anything dangerous waiting for us, we'll need your strength." Bell's smile faded slightly as he stared ahead, down the long, winding staircase that led to even deeper parts of the dungeon, the 100th floor, a place no adventurer had ever seen. His instincts told him that something monstrous awaited them below. "I'll help from here on out," Bell finally said, his tone shifting to one of seriousness. "We'll need to work together if we want to survive what's coming." Refreshed from their brief break, the group continued their descent. Now, with Bell actively participating, the difficulty of the battles they faced seemed to drop significantly. Finn's tactics became sharper, Reveria's spells more potent, and Otter's strikes more devastating. Bell moved like a ghost among them, his speed and strength overwhelming the enemies that dared to stand in their way. His Familia members followed his lead, adapting to his movements with ease. Together, they were an unstoppable force, carving through the dungeon with unmatched precision. As they pushed deeper, the dungeon itself seemed to shift around them. The walls became darker, almost pitch black, with strange, warped patterns etched into the stone. It was as if something had clawed its way through, leaving deep gouges and marks that covered the once solid walls. The ground, too, was uneven and cracked, littered with the remains of ancient structures and bones of long-forgotten creatures. The atmosphere was suffocating now. A heavy, foreboding presence loomed over them, pressing down on their spirits. Even Bell felt it, a deep, primal fear that something was waiting for them. Something enormous. "This place," Reveria murmured, her eyes scanning the warped surroundings. "It's like the dungeon itself is broken." Finn ran his fingers over one of the massive claw marks on the wall. "These are too large for any monster we've encountered. Whatever did this was huge and desperate." Bell's gaze hardened. He could feel it, the immense power that had once been contained here. Something had been trapped in this part of the dungeon, a creature, or being of unimaginable strength. And it had fought, tooth and nail, to escape. The 100th floor, the staircase spiraled downwards for what felt like an eternity, the shadows thickening with every step. When they finally reached the 100th floor, the air was cold, the kind of cold that sank deep into the bones and refused to leave. The walls here were more warped than ever, as if something had violently torn through them. Massive chunks of stone were missing, entire sections of the dungeon collapsed and broken. The floor itself was uneven, with deep fissures running through the ground like scars. Bell stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. His instincts were screaming at him, warning him that they were on the verge of something catastrophic. "This place is different," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels wrong." Suddenly, a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the floor. It was a sound so powerful, so ancient, that it reverberated through their bodies, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The walls trembled as the sound grew louder, a terrifying growl from the depths of the abyss. The group froze, their eyes wide as they looked into the abyss-like darkness that stretched ahead of them. The sound continued to grow, a mixture of thunderous roars and earth-shaking tremors. What is that? Lily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Otter clenched his fists, his eyes narrowing. It's coming from deep within. Finn tightened his grip on his spear. Whatever it is, it's enormous. Bell took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something that had been locked away for a reason. Whatever it was, it had escaped its prison, and it was waiting for them. It's close, Bell said, his voice steady despite the fear, clawing at his chest. And it's approaching quickly. As the rumbling grew louder, echoing through the warped walls of the dungeon, the group braced themselves for what was to come. They had faced countless monsters, endured impossible odds, but whatever awaited them in the depths of the 100th floor was unlike anything they had ever seen, and they would face it together. The chapter ends with the sound of the earth-shattering roar echoing through the endless darkness, a harbinger of the battle to come. The atmosphere in the deep floors of the dungeon was suffocating. A dark, oppressive air enveloped the group of elite adventurers as they pushed deeper into unknown territory. Every step was cautious, each breath calculated, as the walls of the labyrinthine structure seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The deeper they went, the more it felt like they were delving into something more than just stone and shadows, something ancient and angry. Suddenly, the distant rumble of deep, guttural growls reached their ears, echoing through the narrow tunnel they traversed. Bell, at the front of the group, came to a halt, his senses going on high alert. The sound wasn't from an ordinary monster, it was something larger, more ominous. Stay close, Bell murmured to his companions, his voice firm. The group of adventurers nodded, spreading out slightly as they continued their descent. Otter, Finn, Reveria, Eyest, and the others prepared themselves for whatever awaited them in the darkness ahead. The roars grew louder, and soon they could see it. Emerging from the dim shadows, a monstrous figure slowly came into view, a colossal cyclops, its rocky body covered in jagged stone-like plates that glistened with a dull, earthen shine. Its single, massive eye glared down at them, filled with an unrestrained fury. It let out a roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet, and then it charged. Bell's lips curved into a grin. He could feel the thrill of the fight ahead. This was the challenge they had been waiting for. His hand moved slowly to the hilt of his katana, fingers curling around the handle as he took a step forward, assuming the IAI stance, the stance of unsheathing. "Stand back," he whispered, his voice carrying across the group. And then, in a flash, Bell vanished. To the others, it was as if he had simply blinked out of existence. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, just as quickly, Bell reappeared behind the Cyclops, standing tall, his sword already returning to its sheath. The sharp click of the katana settling back into place echoed. A second later, the Cyclops froze. A deep gash appeared across both of its legs, and with a heavy groan, the massive creature crumbled, its legs severed at the knees. Dust and debris exploded outward as it fell, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the gigantic monster. Otter and Finn wasted no time. With a nod to each other, they rushed forward, their weapons ready. Reveria was behind them, her magic already charged. She extended her staff, her eyes narrowing in concentration as she called out her most powerful incantation. Incinerate, Inferno burst. A blast of searing fire magic surged toward the downed Cyclops, the flames colliding with the creature's rocky neck. The intense heat melted a portion of its stone armor, but only slightly. The durability of these monsters was unlike anything they had faced before. Even Reveria's strongest magic could barely leave a mark. But it was enough. Otter's mighty axe swung down, followed by Finn's sharp spear, and in a combined effort, they severed the Cyclops' neck. The giant let out one last groan before its head hit the ground, rolling away. With a heavy thud. "Keep moving," Bell called out, his eyes already scanning the area for the next threat. The adventurers continued their descent, cutting through countless monsters, cyclopes, hecatoncheias, and other behemoths that roamed the deep floors. Each encounter pushed them to their limits, each enemy more formidable than the last. It was as if the dungeon itself was resisting their advance, determined to stop them from discovering whatever lay At its heart, after what felt like an eternity of fighting, the group finally found themselves standing in front of an ancient stone tablet. Its surface was worn and cracked, but the symbols etched into it were still visible. The air around it felt different, older, filled with a power that seemed to seep into their very bones. Bell stepped forward, his eyes scanning the text. The script was strange, but as he focused, he found he could understand it. The name carved into the top of the tablet sent a shiver down his spine. Gaia. It's a message, Bell murmured, his voice barely audible. The others gathered around him, their eyes fixed on the tablet as Bell began to read aloud. The gods of the heavens were not the first to rule this world. Long before them, there were Titans, children of Uranos, the primordial sky. They reigned supreme, their power unmatched. But Uranos, in his fear, ordered their imprisonment, his children, bound by chains forged by his will. Imprisoned beneath the earth, they rotted, their anger festering. Gaia, their mother, wept for her children. She begged the gods that came after, the ones known as Olympians, for aid. But they laughed at her plea, dismissing her sorrow as folly. In their arrogance, they sealed her away as well, trapping her in the very structure they called the dungeon, a place where her rage would fuel the birth of monsters. Her children's essence twisted into creatures of chaos. Bell paused, his heart pounding in his chest. The words seemed to echo in his mind, triggering a memory, a voice from long ago, telling him stories of the ancient past. He remembered hearing the name Gaia as a small child, though he couldn't remember where or from whom. This can't be true, Reveria whispered, her eyes wide with shock. The dungeon, a prison for Gaia, for the Titans. Finn's face was grim. The monsters we've been facing, Cyclopes, Hecatoncheas, those were creatures tied to the Titans in ancient mythology. It's starting to make sense. Bell clenched his fists, his mind reeling. All his life, he had thought of the dungeon as a challenge, a place to grow stronger, to prove himself. But now, it seemed as though it was something much darker, a prison, a tomb for beings whose anger had never subsided. Eyest looked at Bell, her eyes searching his. What do we do now? Bell took a deep breath, steadying himself. The truth was overwhelming, but it didn't change their mission. They had come here to reach the bottom, to confront whatever awaited them. We keep going, Bell said, his voice resolute. We've come too far to turn back now. If the dungeon is a prison, then we need to know what lies at its heart. And if Gaia's rage is what fuels these monsters, then we need to put an end to it. The others nodded, determination hardening their expressions. They had faced countless challenges before, and they would face this one as well, together. As they turned to continue their descent, Bell couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer just fighting for Orario, or even for the surface world. They were facing something far more profound, a battle against the anger of an ancient world, one that had been forgotten by time but never truly silenced. And for that, they would need every ounce of strength they had. The group of adventurers, battle-worn and weary, moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors of the dungeon, their senses on high alert for any threats. They had fought through countless waves of monsters and traversed floors more dangerous than any they had faced before. Finally, they found themselves moving toward what they thought would be the exit of this floor, one they were familiar with, a cavernous opening that marked the transition to the next. But when they arrived, they were met with an unexpected sight. Instead of the rocky mouth of a cave, there stood an imposing, blackened gate. The ancient symbols carved into it seemed to shimmer in the dim light, forming the unmistakable words, Hade's domain. The gate was massive, easily 3 times the height of Otter, and appeared almost out of place, as though someone had set a door meant for another world in the middle of this ancient dungeon. Where's the exit? Eyest murmured, her voice filled with confusion. Finn's eyes narrowed as he scanned the gate, his mind trying to make sense of the anomaly. This shouldn't be here. I've never heard of anything like this before. Just as they were about to discuss their next move, a voice reached their ears, gentle, soothing, and filled with a sadness that seemed to echo across the ages. Please enter, dear children. With your strength, You may be able to finally help me save my children. I beg of you." The adventurers glanced at each other, bewilderment plain on their faces. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. It was soft, like a mother pleading for her child's safety, and it made their hearts clench. Riveria raised her staff, her eyes focused. "Who are you?" she asked. "And what do you mean by saving your children?" There was a pause before the voice spoke again, gentle but heavy, with sorrow. "I am Gaia, the mother of all life. Long ago, my children, the Titans, were imprisoned, sealed beneath the earth by the will of their father, Uranos, and by those who came after, the gods. They laughed at my pain, mocked my tears. And now I seek your aid. You, who are strong enough to descend this far into my prison, may be strong enough to help me free them." Bell felt a chill run down his spine. The name Gaia had haunted him since they found that tablet. Now here it was, not a memory or inscription, but a living voice. He clenched his jaw, steeling himself. "What do you mean, free them?" Bell asked, stepping forward. His voice was steady, but the uncertainty was clear in his eyes. "And what do you want from us?" "My children's rage and suffering have created the monsters you fight. I wish to end their pain, to give them peace at last. But for that, the gods that wronged them must be vanquished. The ones who carry the legacy of those who laughed at their pain must be removed from this world." Riveria stiffened, and Finn's expression grew wary. "Vanquish the gods," Otter repeated, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Gaia's voice, still gentle, continued, "Not all gods, my dear children, only those who are of Greek origin. Their power is tied to my children's suffering. If they are removed, the chains will break. You will be my champions, and I will grant you the power you need to see this through." Bell's heart pounded. The implications were overwhelming. To think of battling gods, it wasn't just dangerous, it was almost blasphemous. But then, the mention of Greek origin brought some relief to his heart. Freya was Norse, and that meant she would not be a target. It was selfish, he knew, but it was also the source of his courage. If it meant ending suffering and saving Gaia's children, then maybe, just maybe. He stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. "If we agree, what will you give us to face gods? And even Hades' domain?" Silence hung in the air for a moment, and then, before their eyes, shimmering forms appeared, a set of sheathed swords, suspended in midair. Each blade was pristine, blank and without distinguishing features. "These blades will become the instruments of your will," Gaia said, her voice filled with an almost maternal warmth. "They shall be forged by your hearts, shaped by your intentions. They are God's layers, bound only to those who wield them with purpose." The adventurers looked at each other, a mixture of awe and hesitation in their eyes. But Bell stepped forward first, drawn by an unexplainable pull. His hand reached out, wrapping around the hilt of one of the sheathed blades. The moment he touched it, a bright light enveloped his body, and his eyes closed involuntarily. He could feel something ancient, powerful, pouring into him, filling every corner of his being. He felt the sorrow of Gaia, the rage of her children, the hopes of those who sought freedom. And he knew he was not alone. One by one, the others reached for their blades, their forms similarly enveloped by the light. Slowly, the adventurers collapsed, unconscious, their bodies unable to handle the sudden surge of power and the burden of Gaia's plea. The swords shimmered, changing their shape as each adventurer's hand met the hilt. They transformed, unique to each of them, a reflection of the power they now held, the responsibility they had accepted. Time passed. When they awoke, they were lying on the rocky ground, their heads pounding. Bell blinked, pushing himself up with a groan. The gate to Hades' domain still loomed before them, but something had changed. The swords they held were no longer blank. Bell's was a deep, dark steel, pulsating with an otherworldly energy, symbols carved into its surface that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. Riveria looked down at her own blade. It was a delicate, slender sword, glowing faintly with a soft blue light. Otter's was enormous, a heavy broadsword, dark as night, with veins of crimson running along its length. Finn's blade seemed almost alive, like it was breathing with power, its edge glowing a subtle gold. "These are God's layers," Bell whispered, or in his voice. The power that radiated from the blades was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was frightening, but also exhilarating. He understood now. They were to be champions, not just adventurers, but avengers of ancient wrongs, chosen by Gaia herself. Are we ready for this?" Eyest asked, her eyes wide, still staring at the sword in her hand. Bell looked at each of them, seeing the uncertainty and fear. But then he turned his eyes toward the gate, that imposing symbol of the unknown. He thought of Gaia's words, of the suffering that had created this place, of the rage and sorrow she wanted to end. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword and nodded. "We have to be," he said. "If what Gaia says is true, then this is the only way. We have to end this." He stepped forward, the others following close behind, and as he reached out to touch the gate, it slowly swung open, revealing the dark, yawning abyss of Hades' domain beyond. And with that, they stepped through, leaving behind the known world of the dungeon and entering a place that belonged not to monsters, but to gods and the echoes of their sins. The champions of Gaia stirred, each feeling the power from the ancient blades resonate through their bodies. It was as if the swords had become an extension of their very souls, adapting and attuning to their individual natures. Bell held his sword in his hand, feeling the heavy, yet strangely balanced weight of it, and he marveled at the newfound strength. His sword seemed almost alive, a weapon, capable of firing slashes through the air, of cutting magic as easily as flesh, and cleaving the divine itself. He looked at his comrades, each of them examining their own blades. Riveria's slender sword hummed, with a quiet but palpable energy, dancing with soft blue light. It seemed to sing in harmony with her magic, making her feel the ease of casting magic without needing a chant. Otter's broadsword was a brute force incarnate, its edge lined with dark crimson veins as if anticipating the blood of their enemies. Eyest's sword, almost invisible to the eye in its speed, had an ethereal gleam, born to dance through the air with unmatched agility. They had stepped through Gaia's gate and now found themselves standing on blackened earth under a crimson sky. This place wasn't part of the dungeon. It wasn't a natural cavern, nor the crafted halls of an ancient civilization. It was something else. Hades' domain. The sky was a swirling vortex of red clouds, and the air seemed to weigh them down, as though resisting their presence. Bell's heart clenched with a mix of anticipation and fear. They were here for a purpose that weighed heavy on his conscience, the slaughter of the Greek pantheon. While he understood that these gods had wrought untold suffering on Gaia's children and had used their power recklessly in the mortal realm, there was still a small part of Bell that hesitated. He had known Zeus as his grandfather, a caring and strong figure in his childhood, and Hera had become a powerful mentor of sorts since their meeting. They had shaped his life in countless ways. But Gaia's voice, sorrowful and filled with deep pain, had not minced words when she explained to him what these gods had done. Their manipulation, their games, their exploitation of mortals, even those who loved him, were not without sin. They had wronged this world, and it had to end. For the good of everyone, for the promise of peace that Gaia had offered. Bell had made up his mind. Zeus and Hera may not die by his hand, but they would pay for their deeds nonetheless. He sighed, gripping the hilt of his blade. There would be time for these thoughts later. For now, he had a mission. The path in front of them led into a darkened abyss, the blackened stones beneath them seeming to absorb all light. As they moved forward cautiously, the earth beneath their feet began to rumble. Suddenly, a massive beast appeared before them, a three-headed hound, its eyes glowing with malevolent fire. The monster's body seemed forged from the flames of hell itself, with lava-like veins glowing along its blackened fur. Each of the heads bared vicious fangs, snarling, saliva dripping like molten lava. "Cerberus," Finn said, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "Guardian of the underworld." Riveria's grip on her sword tightened. "Looks like this is our first real test." The colossal beast roared, the sound reverberating through the ground like an earthquake. It lunged forward, all three heads snapping in unison, their massive jaws aiming to crush the intruders before they could proceed any further. Bell's eyes focused, his body moving faster than he even thought possible. His blade, forged with the very essence of Gaia's will, seemed to guide him, pushing him to limits he never imagined reaching. In an instant, he vanished from where he stood, leaving only a blur behind. The next moment, he reappeared behind Cerberus, his sword glowing with a dangerous light. The three heads of the monstrous hound remained poised for an attack, but then a clean line of blood erupted from their necks. Bell slowly sheathed his sword, and with the click of the hilt, the heads of Cerberus fell one by one, thudding against the ground with a sickening finality. The others barely had time to react before they felt a strange shift in the air. There was no cheer of victory, no sense of accomplishment. Instead, the space around them twisted and distorted as if they had triggered some unseen mechanism by defeating Cerberus. The ground beneath them rippled like water, and the crimson sky overhead seemed to collapse upon itself. Bell's eyes widened, and he tried to shout a warning, but before the words could leave his lips, they were all enveloped in darkness. The next thing they knew, they were standing in an entirely different location. The air was cold, devoid of life, the crimson sky now replaced by a heavy, oppressive gray. This place felt wrong. There was no movement, no sound, and the stench of decay permeated the air. The ground beneath them was an endless expanse of dark, cracked stone, and in the distance, Bell could see the faint outline of what seemed to be an enormous, ancient structure, like a fortress that had been long abandoned. "What? Where are we?" Eyest murmured, her eyes wide with confusion. Riveria looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. "We're still in Hade's realm, but this is different. The energy here, it feels older, more sinister." Otter's eyes narrowed, his stance immediately shifting to one of defense. "This place is designed to separate us from our path, to test our resolve." Finn nodded, his grip tightening on his golden blade. "And we must press on. There is no turning back now." Bell stood silently for a moment, staring at the imposing structure in the distance. There was something about it, an aura of power that seemed to call out to him. He could feel the presence of something within those ancient walls, something that demanded their attention. He shook his head, turning to the others. "No matter what, we need to stay focused. Gaia's children are still waiting for us. We can't let anything deter us now. We need to find a way through this place, and we need to face whatever comes next." The others nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They had all made their choice, had taken up Gaia's swords and agreed to bear her burdens. There was no turning back, no hesitation. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. With renewed determination, they moved forward, their eyes fixed on the distant fortress. Whatever challenges awaited them within Hade's domain, they would not falter. They were Gaia's champions now, chosen to free her children, and to bring an end to the reign of those who had long tormented the world. And as they walked, the memory of Gaia's gentle voice echoed in Bell's mind, urging them forward. "Please, dear children, save them." With a deep breath, Bell nodded to himself. They would see this through to the end. One step at a time, one battle at a time, they would end the suffering and bring peace to Gaia's children. Together, they stepped into the lifeless wasteland, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The oppressive weight of Hade's domain had worn down Bell and his companions, testing their willpower, patience, and the very limits of their strength. They had faced creatures of unimaginable horror, monstrosities spawned from the very depths of hell, grotesque amalgamations of the worst of mortal fears. Days turned into weeks, weeks seemed like months, and their perception of time began to blur. Every battle pushed them further, dragging every ounce of power and skill they had cultivated over their long journey. Finally, they stood before a massive, pulsating structure, a dark, gnarled mass that seemed to breathe, its surface roiling like molten stone. It was ancient and foreboding, a manifestation of something far more profound and dangerous than anything they had ever encountered in the dungeon. The adventurers knew they were standing in the presence of something extraordinary, something primal, though they had no idea what exactly Typhon was. The sheer aura it exuded left no doubt in their minds. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, and senses heightened. The air itself seemed to warp around the dark mass, twisting as though under the influence of some dreadful power. Bel's heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel Gaia's power pulsating through his blade. Suddenly, the mass began to move. A great, monstrous roar shook the entire cavern, and the grotesque form of Typhon, the ancient primordial, began to take shape. It was a titanic creature, its form almost formless, as if made of raw elemental. Chaos, its countless eyes, burning with crimson fire, glared down at them, and massive tendrils erupted from its sides, thrashing wildly. "Prepare yourselves," Bel shouted, gripping his blade. He could feel the tension of his comrades as they braced for battle. Typhon lunged forward, its tendrils lashing out, each as thick as a tree trunk and crackling with dark energy. The adventurers scattered, each narrowly, avoiding being crushed by the massive appendages. Riveria summoned all her magic, her staff blazing with a brilliant light, and let loose a spell of immense power, a massive bolt of lightning that arced through the air and struck Typhon with explosive force. The creature staggered, its outer shell cracking slightly, but it only seemed to anger it further. Eyest moved like the wind, dashing forward and slicing at one of the tendrils, her blade glowing with a radiant light. She managed to sever one of the massive limbs, but almost immediately, it regenerated, as if fed by the very ground of hell itself. "It's regenerating. We need to find a way to cut it off from its source," Finn shouted as he attacked, his spear glowing with a divine energy. But even his blows, as powerful as they were, could only slow the creature down. Typhon seemed to feed off the very essence of hell, growing stronger the longer they fought. Otter roared in fury, swinging his broadsword with all his might, managing to create a deep gash in Typhon's side, but like the tendrils, it too began to heal almost instantly. Bel watched, his frustration growing. This wasn't working. None of them could leave a lasting impact, except for him, and even then, Typhon's connection to hell meant it could heal faster than he could damage it. He needed more power. He needed to put an end to this nightmare. "Enough," Bel growled under his breath, his patience finally snapping. He sheathed his blade, his entire body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He closed his eyes and focused, feeling the magic well up within him. He opened his eyes, and they blazed with power. His comrades could only watch as Bel's presence seemed to change, something darker, something far more dangerous. With a shout, he moved, faster than they had ever seen him move before. Bel executed a dozen black flashes, the air around him crackling as his blade struck again and again, each blow resonating with a terrifying force, each one magnified by the magic coursing through him. "Domain expansion," he roared, his voice echoing throughout the cavern. A shimmering sphere of energy surrounded Typhon, trapping it in place. Bel sacrificed the sure hit property of his domain, instead feeding all that power back into his own strength. His muscles bulged, his senses sharpened, and his magic reserves surged beyond their limits. He felt the burn, the toll it took on his body, but he couldn't afford to hold anything back. He cast maximum output blues above and below Typhon, creating a spatial tear. The pressure was immense, reality itself seemed to warp under the conflicting forces, and with an ear-splitting roar, Bel unleashed his most devastating attack yet, a barrage of hollow purples. Many purples surged forth, a chaotic, swirling spheres of destructive energy that tore through Typhon's form, obliterating the space between the blues, erasing everything it touched. The monstrous primordial howled in pain, its body breaking apart, its essence scattering. The adventurers watched in awe as Bel released volley after volley of purples, each one striking with devastating force. The energy coursed through him, and he could feel the power of his domain magnified to an almost unimaginable extent, pushing him to his very limits. Finally, as the last of Typhon's form disintegrated, Bel fell to his knees, breathing heavily. The cavern was silent, save for the sound of his labored breathing. The others rushed over to him, helping him to his feet. "It's over," Eyest said quietly, her eyes wide with both awe and concern. Bel nodded, though he was barely conscious. He had pushed himself beyond his limits, sacrificing much of his power to see this through. But it had been worth it. Typhon was defeated. But before they could celebrate, before they could even catch their breath, an irritating, mocking voice cut through the silence. Well, quite the show, wasn't it? The adventurers turned, and their eyes fell upon a figure, a man standing casually at the edge of the cavern, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He had an almost aristocratic air about him, his features sharp and eyes glinting with mischief. Something about his face, his demeanor, made all of them want to punch him immediately. Who the hell are you? Otter growled, his hands gripping his sword tightly. The man simply chuckled, stepping forward. Oh, just someone who's been watching you struggle. Quite entertaining, I must say. But now, let's see how you fare against a real challenge, shall we? The irritation in his voice was palpable, and the sheer audacity of the man standing there, acting like he had any control over the situation, made Bell grit his teeth in frustration. He was exhausted, they all were, and now this newcomer had appeared, challenging them in the aftermath of their grueling battle. Get ready, Bell muttered, standing up straight, his hand once again going to his blade. We're not done yet. His comrades stood beside him, weapons at the ready. They had faced the wrath of hell itself, and they would face whatever this man had to offer. Together, they would see this through to the end. Bell's body shook, every muscle in his frame tensed painfully as he drew in more magic than he had ever dared to attempt before. The sensation was nearly unbearable, with waves of energy coursing through him, there, clash triggering a constant sequence of black flashes within his own body. Each flash racked him with agony, but also brought a significant boost in his power, an increase he desperately needed. Standing before him was Hades, a menacing figure exuding an aura of supremacy. In Hades' domain, his power seemed absolute. He was untouchable, unshakable, and every attack Bell and his comrades threw at him had been rendered useless. Instead, Hades seemed to grow more amused with every attempt. He moved like a shadow, his laughter echoing through the dark, barren landscape as he taunted them. Did you really think you could defeat me here? Hades' voice cut through the air, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. In my own domain, I am invincible. The adventurers were battered, blooded, and their strength had nearly given out. Eyest struggled to her feet, her determination undeterred, but her body weakened. Otter clenched his fists, a deep growl of frustration emanating from him as he eyed Hades, who barely seemed to acknowledge the group's efforts. Bell realized the truth quickly. No matter how strong they were, they couldn't harm Hades here, not while they were in his domain. Any more attempts to fight would only end in their demise. They needed to escape, and they needed to do it now. Focusing every last drop of his strength, Bell clenched his teeth and allowed the clashing magic within him to reach a critical point. He could feel his magic output rising exponentially, a feeling that almost bordered on madness as the energy threatened to tear him apart from the inside. Everyone, hold on to me, he shouted, his voice strained from the pressure. The others, without hesitation, reached out, grasping his arms, their eyes filled with trust and desperation. They had no other choice. They were putting everything in Bell's hands. He had a single chance. He tore open space itself, just for a fraction of a second, using the immense energy at his disposal to create a momentary tear in the fabric of hell. The air screamed as it ripped apart, the world folding in on itself in a blur of darkness and light. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then, they vanished, pulled through the tear that Bell had created. Back in Orario, the hospital room, Bell's eyes slowly fluttered open, the world coming back to him in a haze. He was lying on a bed, and the room was filled with a soft, sterile light. He looked around, recognizing the familiar surroundings of one of Orario's hospital rooms. He felt weak, his entire body ached from the strain he had put it through, and he could barely move. He turned his head and saw his companions in nearby beds, each of them similarly resting and recovering from their ordeal. Eyest was awake, looking at him with relief in her eyes, while Otter was sitting upright, already looking ready to fight once more. We made it, Bell said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The others nodded, exhaustion evident on their faces. Before they could say more, the door to their room opened, and in walked a group of gods and goddesses, Freya, Loki, Hephaestus, Hermes, and Zeus, among others. Their expressions were mixed, relief, concern, curiosity. Freya immediately made her way to Belle's side, her eyes softening at the sight of him. "You did it, Belle. You brought them all back." Belle gave a weak smile. "Not without a cost. And not without help," he replied. The gods gathered around the room, their faces a mix of emotions. Zeus stepped forward, a serious expression on his face. "Tell us what happened, Belle. We need to know everything." Belle recounted the battle with Hades, his description vivid. He spoke of the creature Typhon, the fight that left them broken, and the sudden appearance of Hades, his power overwhelming, his cruelty unmatched. The gods listened in silence, their faces growing more solemn as Belle detailed how Hades had toyed with them, how he had used the very fabric of his domain to nullify their every effort. He was untouchable there, Belle finished, a hint of frustration evident in his voice. "I tried everything I could, but nothing worked. He beat us easily. If we had stayed any longer, we would have been done for." The gods exchanged glances, a heaviness filling the room. Hades was a dangerous opponent, and now they knew that within his own domain, he was virtually undefeatable. Freya laid a gentle hand on Belle's arm. "You did what you had to. You saved everyone, and you survived. That's what matters." Loki folded her arms, a frown on her face. "Still, this complicates things. If we can't fight him on his own turf, we'll need to come up with another strategy. We can't afford to let him run rampant." Zeus nodded in agreement, his eyes narrowing. "We'll need to be smart about this. Hades is not an opponent we can take lightly. We'll need every bit of strength we can muster, and a plan that accounts for his strengths." As the gods continued to discuss among themselves, Belle's companions slowly began to sit up, their injuries still healing. There was a grim determination in the air, a shared understanding that they would have to face Hades again, and that next time they couldn't afford to lose. When the gods left, wishing them a speedy recovery, Belle looked at his comrades, each of them worn but resolute. Eyest spoke first, her voice soft but firm. "We need to train harder than we ever have. We need to be ready for him." Finn nodded, his expression serious. "We underestimated him. We can't let that happen again." Otter clenched his fist, his eyes fierce. "Next time, we will be prepared, no matter what it takes." Belle lay back on his bed, his mind racing. He needed something that could truly kill Hades. He had used every ounce of power he had, and it still hadn't. The next part is on its way, so unless you want to be that one person who hears about it last, like and subscribe now to stay ahead of the game. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It's about to get epic. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next chapter.